All right, so we're in part 2 of our workshop where we're going to spend most of our time. And the first thing I'd like to point out is in the left corner here, this drop down where it shows that we have multiple targets. So if you see this showing, that means your multi-target support is working. So that's good. All right, so if you look at this picture here, this gives us the main idea of what we want to achieve in the workshop. And this idea is that we're going to have a configuration server that has Ansible on it, and it has a couple of files and items here that helps us manage all our assets that we want to control, right? And in this case, a web server, it's a single one, but you can imagine maybe there were hundreds of these and some databases, et cetera, right? So for the purpose of the workshop, there's just going to be one, but that's going to already be hard enough. So in order to actually access this web server, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make some sort of connection between these two. For example, that we can actually SSH between these machines and be able to issue commands through that protocol. And in order to do that, we're going to need a private key, just like when we've done before, where we passed SSH-I with the identity file. So that's going to be the private key that's stored in the server. And we need to ensure that that key is authorized to be used for authentication in the server. So we're going to show you how to do that step. And as you're doing this workshop in a terminal or within some of the cells of the notebook, you should be able to run op-unit verify to check your progress on the workshop. And it's going to essentially check the configuration server and the web server to see if those things are in place. And ultimately, what we'll do at the end is once we have this connection set up, we're going to do a couple of things of where we install Ansible and use it to perform a really simple task where we basically install the web server software on the machine. All right, so to start with, what we're going to try to do is create that connection between the server. And to start with, we're going to use the SSH keygen command. And we're going to use this for our protocol, or for our security protocol. And this will be our file name. Or that's the comment inside the file. And then this is the actual file name. All right, so I'm gonna run this command. And you can see it says that it's created this fingerprint, or this file. And if you actually want to see what is here, then we can see that these two things were created, a web server and a web server.pub, right? So we poke around a little bit more. And if I just do head web serve, then you can see this is the private key. So this is all the stuff is that we're going to be keeping on our end. And if you look at the web server.pub, this is going to be the public key, right? So it looks a little bit different, right? It's a single line versus I think the other one has 40 lines. Each of those are part of the algorithm for the computing the key. And how are these exactly used? Well, the main idea is the public key is the thing that we give away. So that's the thing that we give to the, to all the servers we want permission to access, and we keep the private key, right? So that's the thing that's hidden away, right? And so we will be using that public key to authorize access of the private key for connections to the web server. And we will be keeping it inside of the configuration server itself. So that way we can use it as part of our Ansible commands and just being able to run simple commands like SSH. Okay, so let's actually do that. So we're gonna need to be able to get that key and get it into our configuration server. So this is kind of a neat opportunity to show you a couple of fun commands in Windows, and Mac, and Linux has their own version of this, but you can actually use the command line to send things into your clipboard. So in this case, what I can do is if I run this, then I will actually have the content of that file in my clipboard, right? Okay. And so what's interesting about this red box here, this red box is the configuration server that we set up earlier before, and we're already inside of it. So this is part of the target support that we're talking about. And that means I could just start, trying to create this file. So in this case, it needs to be inside the SSH directory. And I'm going to just use Vim to create it. Make sure I got into insert mode, do paste, escape, and write and exit. Okay, so that file should be there, should be okay. And now I need to go into the public server. So on the public server, I need to get the public key and be able to paste that in. So I'm going to pop back up here, and instead of the private server key, I'm going to run this to get the public one. Okay, so that's in my clipboard now. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to edit this. So let's just go into the SSH directory. And then you see this authorized keys file that already exists. And we can kind of see what's in there. And what I essentially want to do is I want to append an entry to this. So I want to append this other key that can allow us to get into this machine. And if you're curious what this key is, this is actually the command or the key that Baker X and Vagrant use to get in. So this is that insecure public key that you see in, or insecure private key file that you see that we've used in the past. This is this is actually baked into the image itself, so that it makes it easy to get in. Okay, so we're going to edit this file. I'm going to go to the end and then paste in this one. Okay, so hopefully that is all good. So let's actually check this out. So I'm back in my config server, the red one, and I'm going to run this SSH command. And we actually got something that we expect to happen. Essentially what has happened is, if you look at the complaint here, warning unprotected private key file, it's saying that the permissions are too open, right? So it didn't like that. And you see something, you see the same message up here. Okay, and essentially what that's saying is, if we look back in the SSH directory, and you look at this web server file, you notice that your user can read and write to it. That's cool, but that the kind of other groups and other kind of web applications can actually be able to read this. And as a security measure, that's considered too open, because remember, this is supposed to be a private key. And so the recommended permissions is to use something like basically turn off all the other groups access, so that only the user itself could access this. So in this case, only the Vagrant user. And now that I've fixed that, I should be able to click up, 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 find my command again, and run it. Okay. So I'm actually now in this blue guy, you see where it says web server. You can see the host name here, web server. So I've actually successfully SSH from the config server into my web server. So that verifies that connection works. So that's pretty cool. So there's a couple of things that are interesting to note when I run this. So one of the things is you'll see that it adds this entry into the known host file. So that's something that sometimes will come up. And what else should I point out? Pretty much it. All right, so I'm gonna exit from here. Or well, if you just want to double check you're actually in the right place, you can run this command and you'll see that indeed I have this .100 IP address, which is different. So I'm gonna exit from this, which means I'm back in my config server. Okay, and then this was a good chance to pause and see what happens when I run the op unit verify step. Because if you did get something wrong, because there's a good chance that maybe you swapped the private and public keys, or when you tried to paste in stuff that you know, you're not the best Vim user, and that's okay, that things got messed up. Maybe you missed changing the permission authorized key. So all those are things. So if you let this run for a second, it will give you a report that will help you see what is going on. All right, and the results came back, and as you expect, some of the things I have done right, and that's actually, you know, so for example, here it'll check to see does the key exist inside the authorized, does the public key exist within the authorized key thing? And it looks like, yes, it does. So run those checks and see if you can get that. If you did, that's actually the hardest part of the workshop. And when we used to do this kind of manually without notebooks, you'd be surprised how hard this was for people to do. It would often take just an hour to do this step. But hopefully with all this kind of scaffolding, this will help you do that a little bit. So now that we have all this working, I want to point out just, you know, what does this really enable us to do? So from a config server, I am able to now do things like this, where I can take a command. All right, sorry. So I can take a command and paste this. And so, for example, I mean, that's not that interesting, but being able to, you know, get the directory of the web server. But it becomes more interesting when I could start doing stuff like, you know, sudo apt-get update, right? So make sure that I've, you know, installed packages and perform security updates and make sure files exist in the right place that they should, and update config files. So all the things that you would want to make sure are working on your system. All right, so just as an exercise, what I'd like to see you do is run the touch command and see if you can make that file exist on the remote server, right? So you should just be able to add that to the end of this SSH command. Okay, so I mean, I think that, you know, it's cool that we can do this, but why not just stop here? Like, is this, you know, why not just keep sending bash commands over SSH? Is that good enough for configuration management? So as we mentioned in the lecture, and as you saw in the homeworks that you did, that just sending ad hoc commands over in scripts can be very error prone. And most importantly, they're not idempotent. So that if something fails, like you're curling to fetch a template file that you needed, and that failed because the network temporary blipped, then that means all the other steps you're going to have are just going to fail. And it could be written in a way that it's invisible to you. It was a silent failure. And so you thought things were updating when they weren't. And that's even worse if that's only happening on some machines. And so that you have this mixed state. And so what we essentially need is we need a way to kind of do, to send commands over to different servers, but to be able to have a little bit more control over the process. And so to do that, we're going to install Ansible, which is one of the different configuration management tools that we talked about. I'm going to go ahead and start the run for this. So this is inside the configuration server, and it's adding Ansible and the repository for Ansible, updating apt-get, and installing Ansible. So that's going on. And while that's happening, it's worth noting essentially how Ansible works. It's actually much more straightforward than you would imagine. Basically what happens is with Ansible, instead of using random bash commands to send over things, it will actually just send over random Python scripts and snippets. And so what it will actually do is it will copy over different Python files into a temporary directory and execute them. And that implicitly means that you need Python installed on the target machine, which is fine. But essentially it will translate all the Ansible commands into Python scripts and run them on the machine. And all the commands are designed to be a little bit more resilient and support things related to DevOps. So we'll get more into the nitty gritty of that. But right now, what we're going to try to do is replicate our kind of simple connection test, but do this through Ansible. And so in this case, what we're going to start with is an inventory file. So an inventory file is one way that Ansible is able to track all the assets that are being managed by Ansible. And in this case, this is using an INI format. So this is a variable, and then these are all the kind of keys that could be under it. So usually what you'll see is this will be a label, and then you're going to see a line of different server entries that belong to that label. And in this case, I give an IP address and different variables that will be available to Ansible. So in this case, who the SSH user is, and then where the private key is. And then this is just variables that will also be supplied for Ansible, but only available to the web group. So there's a lot to Ansible, and this is only part of it. But the key idea here is we're just basically saying, here's the server and what you need to connect to it. So I'm going to hit this little create button, and then I'm actually taking advantage of the notebook's ability to create this file on the config server for me so that I don't have to worry about using Vim and all that sort of stuff. All right, so now that that file exists, I could run the ping command. Okay, and so this shows that from the configuration server, I was able to use the ping module given this inventory and say that Ansible was able to connect to my web server and successfully make a connection, right? So the bong part of the ping. Right, so that's pretty cool. But let's get to the thing that we actually want to do. And it's kind of funny because it's a really simple command. But I wanted to show you that once you kind of have all this in place, that this can be pretty powerful, right? So here I have this Ansible command, and I'm gonna ask you to type it in just so that you can kind of get it in a little bit more. So I'm gonna actually do this too. So I'm gonna say Ansible and then all. And all is referring to the host that are available. So remember in our inventory, we had things like web, but imagine you had other things like databases or something like that. Then it would mean that, okay, also web and databases, anything in that inventory is going to be targeted by this command. Then I'm going to provide -b, which is become. And become means that if a command needs to have sudo permissions, then that you're allowed to escalate up and become sudo. Then I'm going to use the module command, which means use the apt-get module, and then give it a couple of arguments. So in this case, I'm going to set the variable package to nginx. The state is going to be present, and update cache true. I don't actually have to do this because we recently did this, but this would ensure that apt-get update is run before doing the apt-get install. And then I'm going to give it the inventory. All right, hopefully I typed that all okay. All right, so that might take a minute or two because it's installing that web server package on our target environment. And we'll also set up the service needed to start it up. So once that command is done, the web server actually will be available and we will be able to click this and browse it. So let's wait for that to happen. All right, cool. So we finally got back some results. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So we get the host that the action was performed on, and then a summary of things like the output of the command. So this is really this is like JSON output. So this is all the stuff that was run for that command. And when you run more Ansible, the output that you can get can be pretty sophisticated. So we'll have to talk about that later. But let's actually check for the fun part. So let's look here and see our web server is running. So pretty cool. All right. Now what I want to show you here is if I run absent, and I need to look up something real quick. All right. So I want to be able to say that the desired state I have of this is that it's absent. And I have to provide one more thing, AutoRemove yes, so that it's going to remove the service for nginx. Otherwise, I would have to wait until the machine rebooted for that to happen. All right, so you can see that this ran, and it says that it removed everything. So let's actually run this again and then see what happens. Okay, so what's pretty neat about this is you can actually see the idempotence in effect. So it will actually detect that because there was nothing there, that running that again won't actually do anything. And you'll see that the state was the change state is actually false. So that's pretty cool. So by default, when you run Ansible in its playbooks and you run all these commands, and if the total number of changes was 0, then you know that there was actually nothing that had been updated. And so a good test for a playbook is if you run it once and then you run it a second time. If the second time you see your change to 0, that means ideally you've written a nice idempotent playbook. Let's actually check to see if this is still here. Yeah, whoops. Okay, so we did kill that server. So you can see that we really did remove it. So that's pretty cool. So now you can just run this check, and if you did that SSH touch command correct, then everything here should be running okay. Of course, we also did just kill the server, so you'll probably have to run that before if you delete anything. But that's pretty much it. We've demonstrated, how to set up a server in this kind of pattern where you have a config server that kind of manages everything, kind of holds all the files that you need, and sends, runs Ansible commands to modify remote machines. And in fact, you can do that. So a fun thing to do would be, imagine you provisioned a remote VM from DigitalOcean or somewhere else, and you went back to the inventory file, and then you added the IP address of that in, whatever SSH commands or, keys that you need to access it. And then you run this Ansible command again. Then what should happen is that VM will now have your Nginx server as well, right? So the neat thing about this is all you have to do is add a couple more entries, and all of a sudden all those are now under the same configuration management policies. So that's pretty cool, but you don't want to be writing manual commands like this, right? And so that's why for the next part, which will come up later, we're going to learn how to write playbooks that will allow us to organize these commands into reusable configuration scripts. But this has been good if you can get this far. So good times.